"Why are you helping me, child? You don't even know me." The little girl looked at the trembling old woman before her and answered without a second thought. "Because my mother told me never to walk past someone who needs help." She had no idea whom she had just helped. And she had no idea that only a few hours later, something would happen that would change her mother's life and her own forever. The last light of the day spilled across Manhattan in long red streaks, painting the sides of the tall buildings the color of tired copper. Cars crawled along the avenue with their headlights already on, and the sidewalks were thick with people rushing home from work. Elena walked among them, her hand wrapped gently around her daughter's smaller one. She was 28, dressed in a plain coat that had seen too many winters, and her shoulders carried the quiet weariness of someone who had been on her feet since before sunrise. Beside her, Mia skipped a little every few steps, unable to keep her small body still even at the end of a long day. She was 5 years old, with dark curls that would not stay behind her ears no matter how many times Elena tried to tuck them, and eyes that watched the world as if every corner of it might hide something wonderful. On her back she wore a bright pink backpack, half as big as she was, that held a coloring book, 2 crayons she refused to leave at home, and 1 small bottle of water that her mother packed for her every morning without fail. They were half a block from the crosswalk when it happened. An elderly woman in a plain gray coat and a scarf that had once been fine but was now worn at the edges swayed suddenly near the curb. Her hand shot out for something to hold, found nothing, and she stumbled forward. The old purse she was carrying slipped from her grip and struck the concrete, spilling its contents across the sidewalk in a small, quiet disaster. The crowd flowed around her as if she were a stone in a river. A young man in a suit stepped over a rolling lipstick without looking down. 2 women deep in conversation passed close enough to touch her elbow and never turned their heads. A courier on a bicycle rang his bell impatiently and swerved. Not one of them stopped. Mia stopped. She let go of her mother's hand so quickly that Elena felt the emptiness of her own palm before she understood what her daughter had done. The little girl darted forward, weaving between a pair of long coats, and dropped to her knees beside the elderly woman. Her small fingers began to gather the scattered things at once, working with the serious concentration only a child can bring to a task no one has asked her to do. A folded handkerchief, a pair of thin reading glasses, a pen, a silver key, a crumpled receipt. She placed each item back into the old purse as carefully as if she were putting away her own crayons. Then she paused, sat back on her heels, and slid the pink backpack off her shoulders. She unzipped it, reached inside, and drew out the small bottle of water her mother had prepared for her that morning. She uncapped it with both hands and held it up toward the elderly woman with the same simple offering a child might give a friend. "Here," Mia said softly. "You look thirsty." The old woman's hands were shaking too much to take the bottle at first. Behind them, Elena finally reached the spot where her daughter had knelt. She stopped short, one hand still lifted in the air where Mia's had been a moment before, and stared down at the scene her child had made on the crowded, indifferent sidewalk. Elena did not scold her daughter. She did not even ask Mia why she had let go of her hand. She only lowered herself onto the sidewalk beside them, folded her long coat under her knees, and placed one steady hand on the elderly woman's back. "Ma'am," Elena said softly, tilting her head to catch the woman's downcast eyes. "Are you hurt? Can you tell me if anything feels wrong?" The old woman lifted her face. Up close, Elena saw the pallor beneath the powdered cheeks, the fine tremor along the jaw, the way the thin lips pressed together as if holding back something more than pain. There was a strange dignity in that face, the kind that did not belong to the plain gray coat she was wearing. "I am only tired, dear," the woman whispered. "Please, no ambulance, please." Elena did not argue. She only nodded and turned to help Mia finish gathering what remained on the sidewalk. Her daughter was already reaching for the last item, half hidden beneath the fallen purse. It was a photograph. The colors had faded to soft browns and pale yellows, the corners worn round from years of being touched. Mia picked it up with both hands, the way one lifts something fragile. For a moment the little girl simply looked at it. In the picture stood a tall man in a dark coat, one hand resting on the shoulder of a small boy no older than 5. The boy was looking up at the man with an open, uncomplicated smile that seemed to belong to another lifetime. Mia turned the photograph carefully in her fingers and held it out. "You dropped this too," she said. The elderly woman's breath caught. She reached for the photograph, and when it was safely between her palms, she pressed it to her chest and closed her eyes. Elena saw the way her shoulders tightened around it, as if she were shielding a small living thing from the wind. "Thank you, little one," the woman said. Her voice was very small. "Thank you." Elena waited a few moments before speaking again. Then she began to talk about nothing in particular, in the quiet everyday tone one might use to steady a frightened bird. She spoke about the way the evening light always turned the windows gold along this street. She spoke about Mia losing a tooth last week and refusing to put it under the pillow because she wanted to keep it. She let her words drift over the sidewalk with no purpose, except to give the elderly woman something ordinary to hold on to. Slowly the color returned to the old woman's cheeks. Slowly her breathing evened. "May I ask your name, dear?" she said at last. "Elena," Elena answered. "And this is my daughter, Mia." The woman repeated the names softly to herself, as though tasting them. She did not offer her own. Elena did not ask. When the elderly woman felt steady enough to stand, Elena and Mia lifted her gently between them and walked her to a small stone bench beneath a nearby street lamp. Elena made sure her purse was closed, her scarf straightened, her hands folded in her lap. Then she took her daughter's hand once more, said a quiet goodbye, and stepped back into the current of the city. The old woman watched the two of them until their silhouettes dissolved into the red haze of the setting sun. Her fingers never loosened around the faded photograph, and in her eyes, slowly, silently, tears began to gather. Miles away from the crowded avenue, on a quiet street lined with old trees and older money, a pair of tall iron gates opened without a sound. A dark car slipped through them, rolled along a curved drive, and came to rest before the front steps of a house that most of the city knew by rumor alone. The Moretti estate. Isabella Moretti stepped out of the car with the help of a driver whose eyes remained politely lowered. She wore the same plain gray coat and the same worn scarf, but her posture had already begun to change back into what the house expected of her. Her back straightened, her chin lifted. By the time her shoes touched the marble of the front hall, no one watching would have believed she had spent the last hour sitting on a public bench, breathing through the tremor in her hands. The house received her in its usual way. A butler bowed. A maid took her coat with soft, careful fingers. Someone murmured that dinner would be served whenever Madame wished. No one asked where she had been. No one ever did. Isabella climbed the wide staircase alone. The chandeliers above her burned in their slow, expensive silence. Every step of hers echoed against the cold stone as if the house itself were listening. She thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that a place so full of people could feel so empty of company. In her private sitting room, she closed the door behind her, pressed her back against it, and finally allowed her shoulders to fall. Only then did she cross to the small writing desk by the window and set the worn purse down with the care of someone unpacking something sacred. She opened it. She lifted out the faded photograph. For a long time she only looked at it. The tall man in the dark coat had been dead for many years. The small boy at his side, the one with the wide-open smile, was now 39 years old, feared across the city, and rarely at home before midnight. He was her son. His name was Alessandro, and she could not remember the last time she had seen him smile the way he was smiling in that picture. Isabella pressed the photograph to her chest again, the way she had done on the sidewalk, and let her thoughts turn to the two strangers who had knelt beside her without knowing who she was. A young mother with steady hands, a little girl who had offered her own water without being asked. They had not treated her like a name. They had not treated her like a title. They had treated her, simply, like a person who was falling. She could not remember the last time anyone had done that either. The servants were too respectful. Her son was too busy. And Vivian, the young woman who was soon to marry him, was too careful in his presence, and too something else in his absence. Isabella rang the small silver bell on her desk. Within seconds, her personal assistant, an older man who had served the family for decades, entered without a sound. "There is a young woman named Elena," she said quietly, "and her little daughter named Mia. They helped me this afternoon on the avenue. I would like you to find them. I do not need to explain why." The assistant bowed and withdrew. Isabella turned to her desk, took up a heavy fountain pen, and drew a fresh sheet of cream-colored paper toward her. She began to write a letter. Morning came into the small rented room the way it always did, through the one narrow window that faced a brick wall. Elena stood at the little stove, stirring oatmeal in a chipped pot, while Mia sat on the edge of the sagging couch and tried to pull her socks on by herself. The kettle hissed. A radiator somewhere in the building knocked twice and fell silent. It was a morning like every other morning of Elena's life, until the knock came at the door. Elena froze with the wooden spoon halfway lifted from the pot. No one knocked on their door in the morning. The landlord came only on the 1st of the month, and the neighbors kept to themselves. She wiped her hands on the front of her apron, told Mia to stay on the couch, and crossed the narrow floor. She opened the door. A man stood in the hallway who did not belong to any hallway in this building. He wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit and a coat that looked as if the rain had never once dared touch it. His shoes reflected the dim ceiling bulb. His face was calm, respectful, unreadable. In his gloved hands he carried a single thick envelope, and on the front of that envelope, pressed deep into the heavy cream paper, was a coat of arms that Elena recognized at once. 2 crossed olive branches, a shield, a single letter in the center, M, the Moretti crest. Every breath in Elena's chest went still. Anyone who lived in New York knew that name. Bakers whispered it when they closed their shops early. Old men murmured it in the barber shops when a certain kind of car drove by. Mothers on her street had told her, only half joking, that the Morettis owned more of the city than the mayor did. That family was not spoken of casually. That family was not connected to people like Elena. "Miss Elena," the man said politely. His voice was as neat as his suit. "I have been asked to deliver this to you personally. I will wait downstairs for 1 hour, in case you wish to reply." He handed her the envelope, inclined his head, and turned toward the stairs before she could find any words. Elena closed the door slowly and leaned her back against it. Mia was already off the couch, socks half on, eyes wide with curiosity. "Mama, what is it?" Elena did not answer. She carried the envelope to the small kitchen table, sat down, and slid a trembling finger under the wax seal. Inside was a folded sheet of the same cream-colored paper, written in a fine, old-fashioned hand. The letter was short. It thanked Elena and Mia for a kindness shown the evening before. It invited them to come to an address on the other side of the city that same afternoon, at 4 o'clock. It did not explain why. Near the end, one line lingered a moment longer than the rest. "There is a small thing I would very much like to place into your hands myself." The letter was signed only with a single initial. Elena read it twice. Mia climbed onto the chair beside her and pressed against her arm, whispering that she wanted to go. "Please, please, Mama, could they go?" Elena did not answer at first. She thought of the elderly woman on the sidewalk, of the way her fingers had trembled around a faded photograph, and she said yes. That afternoon, the tall iron gates of the Moretti estate rose slowly before Elena and Mia for the first time. The gates opened without a sound, as though they had been waiting for them. The driver of the black car that had picked them up did not speak, and Mia pressed her small face to the window, watching the trees roll past on either side of the long curved drive. Elena kept her hand tightly around her daughter's, and told herself, over and over, that she could turn back at any moment. She did not believe it, but she told herself anyway. When the house rose into view, Mia forgot to breathe. It was not a house the way their building was a house. It was tall, pale, and grave, with rows of dark windows that seemed to look down at the drive the way older people look down at children they do not yet know. Elena had never stood so close to something that had been built for the sole purpose of being important. An older butler in a dark coat opened the door before they reached it. He inclined his head as if he had been expecting them for years, took Elena's plain jacket with careful hands, and led them across a hallway of polished marble that echoed with every step. It was warm inside, and yet Elena felt cold in a way she could not explain. The house was silent the way a museum is silent, beautiful, watching, not quite alive. They were shown into a large drawing room where tall windows spilled afternoon light across a pale carpet. The butler bowed once and withdrew. Elena and Mia stood very still, in the middle of that vast quiet room, mother holding daughter's hand, neither of them daring to sit. A door on the far side opened. The woman who entered was not the woman from the sidewalk. She wore a long dress, the color of deep wine, her silver hair swept back and pinned with a comb of dark stones. Around her neck rested a rope of black pearls, arranged like a rosary, each bead catching the light with a slow, patient gleam. She walked with the straight back of someone who had been taught to walk that way as a girl. Only her eyes were the same eyes. Mia's hand tightened suddenly in Elena's, and then let go. "The old lady from yesterday," the little girl gasped, forgetting every rule about manners. Isabella laughed. It was a small, surprised laugh that seemed to escape her before she could catch it. She knelt, more slowly than she once might have, and opened her arms. Mia ran into them without hesitation, and Isabella held her for a long moment with her cheek pressed against the child's dark curls. When she straightened again, she turned to Elena. "Please forgive me for what I did yesterday," she said gently. "I dressed the way I did because sometimes I need to walk in the city as an ordinary person. Otherwise I forget what an ordinary person is." She invited them to sit. Elena obeyed only because her legs had begun to feel uncertain. Isabella lowered herself into the chair opposite, folded her hands, and spoke plainly. "I did not ask you here to repay you. Kindness cannot be repaid, and I would not insult you by trying. I asked you here because I would like to offer you work, Elena. Real work. In this house. Elena stared at her. I have watched many people over many years, Isabella continued softly. A mother who raises a child the way you have raised yours is a mother I can trust, and trust is something I no longer find easily under this roof. Elena's throat tightened. She lowered her eyes. For a long moment she could not answer at all. Then she lifted her chin. Madam, she said quietly, I will accept, but only on one condition. I will work for my wages, honestly, every day. I do not want pity. I do not want charity. Whatever you pay me, I will earn. Isabella smiled, and for the first time since her husband had died, the smile reached her eyes. 3 days later, Elena and Mia carried their 2 small suitcases through a side entrance of the Moretti estate. The rooms they were given lay in the staff wing at the eastern end of the house. There were 2 of them, connected by a narrow door. One for Elena, one for Mia. Both were modest, both were spotless, and both had windows that opened, for the first time in Elena's life, onto something green. Mia ran from wall to wall, opening every drawer, testing every light switch, laughing at the softness of the quilt on her small bed. Elena stood in the middle of her own room, with her suitcase still in her hand, and did not move for a long moment. She was thinking, quietly, that a woman could grow used to windows that opened onto trees. She was also thinking that she must not. That first afternoon, once the suitcases were emptied and the beds were made, Isabella came to fetch Mia by the hand and led her through the house to the tall glass doors at the back. Beyond those doors lay the garden. It was larger than Elena had imagined a garden could be. Gravel paths wound between low hedges, past a still pond, past a small stone fountain, and out to the far end of the property, where an enormous rose garden opened like a slow, bright wound in the middle of the lawn. There were roses of every color there, deep crimson roses that seemed to hold the last of the afternoon sun, pale pink ones so soft they looked as though they might dissolve if touched, white ones with hearts of gold, yellow ones, wine-dark ones, and roses so nearly black that Mia gasped when she saw them. Isabella walked slowly among them with the little girl's hand in hers, and named every kind. She spoke as if she were introducing old friends. Mia repeated the names back to her, mangling most of them, laughing at herself, and Isabella laughed too, freely, the way she had once laughed as a young woman long ago. While Isabella walked her small companion through the roses, Elena began her work inside the house. Her post was to oversee the kitchens and the private receptions of the family. The head cook, a large woman with kind eyes and a suspicious mouth, watched Elena for 2 full hours before deciding, without saying so, that this new arrival could stay. Elena worked with her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She learned the names of the staff. She listened more than she spoke. It was late in the afternoon when she first saw him. She was crossing the long main corridor with a folded stack of linens in her arms, and a tall man came down the far end of the passage. He wore a dark suit that fit him the way armor fits a knight. He walked with the straight, decisive step of a man who did not waste motion. He did not turn his head. He did not see her. He passed through a set of double doors and was gone. Elena did not need anyone to tell her his name. She could feel it in the way the house seemed to hold its breath around him. Alessandro Moretti. A few minutes later, a bright laugh rang out from somewhere near the front hall. It was a woman's laugh, musical, polished, and cold, the kind of laugh that fills a room without warming it. Elena did not know yet whose laugh it was, but her hands, without asking her, tightened around the linens she carried. A few days later, Elena had learned enough about the rhythms of the great house to know when the polished laugh she had first heard in the front hall would return. It came in the late afternoons, usually announced by the sharp click of heels on marble and the faint drift of an expensive perfume. Elena did not yet have a name to attach to it. She only knew that when it approached, every servant in the corridor found somewhere else to be. That afternoon, Elena was carrying a silver tray of glasses from the pantry when she heard the voice for herself. Up close, for the first time. "You kept me waiting." The voice was low, almost gentle, and yet it fell on the young serving man in front of it like a thin blade laid flat against skin. Elena stopped just inside the archway of the sitting room, hidden by the half-open door. On the far side of the room stood a woman in her early 30s, dressed in a cream-colored dress that must have cost more than Elena earned in a year. Her dark hair was pinned up in a way that revealed a long, elegant neck. In her hand she held a glass of red wine that a trembling young footman had evidently placed there only seconds too late. "I asked for it at 4:30, the woman said softly. "It is now 3 minutes past. Do you know what happens to a wine when it is allowed to breathe past its moment? Miss Vivian, I am very sorry. I do not interrupt me." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her eyes were the coldest thing Elena had ever seen in that warm, golden room. The young man lowered his head so far that his chin almost touched his chest. Vivian. The name reached Elena at last, and settled there like a stone. At that moment, the double doors at the far end of the hall opened, and Alessandro Moretti walked through them, a stack of papers under one arm, his brow drawn in thought. He was not looking at Vivian. He was not looking at anyone. Vivian's face changed as quickly as a curtain falling. "Darling," she called out, her voice suddenly bright and warm as candlelight. She glided toward him with the wine in one hand and the other outstretched. "You look exhausted. Come, sit with me for a moment. I saved you a glass." Alessandro allowed her to slip her arm through his. He did not smile, but he did not pull away either. The young footman lifted his head just long enough to meet Elena's eyes across the room. In that single glance passed something wordless and old, the private understanding of two people who worked in a house whose owner did not see all of what happened in it. Elena said nothing. She turned quietly and carried her tray away. She was too new to speak. She had no standing here. She did not yet know who would listen, and who would report every word she said. So she kept her mouth closed and her eyes down and her hands busy. 2 floors above, on the second-story balcony that overlooked the front hall, Isabella stood in the shadow of a tall curtain. She had seen everything. Her fingers rested lightly on the balustrade, and at the corner of her eye a small, quiet sadness gathered. Mia found her there a little while later, wandering in from the garden with a rose petal still stuck to her sleeve. The little girl did not understand what was wrong. She only knew the old lady looked sad, and so she climbed onto the bench beside her and sat very close. Then a sound behind them made Isabella turn. Vivian stood at the head of the corridor, one hand resting on the banister, watching them. For a single, unguarded second, her eyes fell on Mia and turned to ice. Then, just as quickly, the ice melted into a smile, so warm and so false that Elena, catching sight of it from below as she passed with her tray, felt something inside her go very still. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither Elena nor Isabella had planned, but which neither of them wished to break. Every morning Mia woke early, dressed herself with fierce concentration, and appeared at the door of Isabella's private sitting room with something small pressed in her hands. Sometimes it was a rose she had chosen from the garden after long deliberation. Sometimes it was a glass of water she had carried across the corridor without spilling a single drop. Sometimes it was nothing at all, only the little girl herself, climbing onto the ottoman at Isabella's feet as if it had been made for her. Isabella never sent her away. They spent long afternoons together in the rose garden, and on the shaded bench beneath the old magnolia tree. Isabella began to speak to Mia about things she had not spoken of aloud in years. She told the little girl about her husband, gone now more than a decade, a tall, gentle man who had smelled always of pipe tobacco and rain. She told her about Alessandro when he was still a small boy, no older than Mia herself, who had once laughed so hard at a stray dog in the garden that he had fallen into the fountain fully dressed and refused to be embarrassed. She told her about a house that had been full of noise once, and about how quiet a house could become after only 2 goodbyes. Mia listened with a 5-year-old's serious attention. She did not always understand. She always understood enough. One afternoon, while Isabella dozed in the sunlight on the garden bench, Mia sat cross-legged on the grass at her feet with a box of crayons Elena had bought her from a corner store. She worked for a long time, tongue caught between her teeth, brow furrowed with the same concentration she had brought to putting Isabella's spilled belongings back into a purse on a sidewalk many weeks before. When she was finished, she stood, dusted the grass from her knees, and held the paper up. "Look," she whispered, "I made us." Isabella opened her eyes. In the center of the drawing stood a very tall man in a dark suit, all straight lines and serious shoulders. On his left stood an older woman with silver hair, a small smile, and a necklace of round black dots at her throat. On his right stood a younger woman in an apron, holding the hand of a small child. The child was in the middle of them all, arms stretched wide, one hand joined to each of the grown-ups on either side. "It is our family," Mia said simply. Isabella did not speak for a long moment. She reached out with fingers that were not entirely steady, took the drawing between them, and looked at it as though she had never seen anything quite like it before. That evening, she carried the paper up to her private bedroom herself. She did not give it to a servant. She stood on a small chair, holding the crayon, drawing against the pale wall beside her bed, and pressed 4 small pieces of tape into place with her own hands. She stepped down, took 2 steps back, and looked at it. Then she went to sleep with the drawing watching over her, and slept better than she had in a very long time. The next afternoon, high above the rose garden, Alessandro Moretti stood at the second-floor balcony with a phone in his hand and a business call already half forgotten. Below him, on the gravel path between the crimson roses, his mother was laughing at something the little girl beside her had said. Not the polite laugh she offered at dinners, not the small, tired smile she gave him when he asked how she was. A real laugh. A young laugh. A laugh he had not heard from her in more months than he could count. The phone in his hand went silent as the person on the other end asked him a question twice. Alessandro did not answer. He was watching his mother. After the sound of his mother's laugh, Alessandro Moretti began, without quite intending to watch her. He was not a man who studied the people in his own house. He studied ledgers, contracts, the weight of a handshake, the pause before a lie. His mother, he had always assumed, was the one part of his world that required no watching. She had been his mother for 39 years. What was there left to notice? And yet, once he had begun, he could not stop. He noticed. First, the way her shoulders drew inward when Vivian entered a room. It was a small thing, no more than the closing of a flower against cold air, but it was there. He noticed, second, that when he asked his mother, over dinner, how she and Vivian had spent their afternoon, Isabella would smile softly and answer with a sentence so smooth and so empty that a stranger might have mistaken it for warmth. He noticed, third, that on 2 separate evenings his mother had opened her mouth as if to say something to him, then closed it again and turned her attention to her wineglass. Alessandro told himself it was age. He told himself she was tired, that the estate was too large for her these days, that he had been too absent, too consumed by the affairs of the family, too willing to leave her in the care of others. He promised himself, quietly, that he would take her to the country house for a week. He promised himself he would be a better son. He did not yet suspect that his mother was carrying a weight she had chosen, out of love for him, not to lay down. That morning he sent for Marco Bellini. Marco arrived within the hour, as he always did, with his easy stride and his ready smile. The two men had known each other since they were boys. They had climbed the same trees. They had bled together on the same nights. Marco was the one man in the organization whom Alessandro allowed to enter the study without knocking, the one man he permitted to pour his own drink from the crystal decanter by the window. Marco called him fratello, brother, and Alessandro had never once questioned the word. They sat down across the wide desk to discuss the week's business, papers, names, movements. Marco listened with his usual careful attention, nodding at the right moments, offering advice with the humility of a man who knew his place at the second chair rather than the first. On the desk between them, beside the folder of documents, rested a small object that Alessandro carried with him almost every day. A pocket watch, wrought in old silver, the case worn smooth by many years of another man's thumb. It had belonged to his father. It had rested against his father's heart at the moment of his father's death. Alessandro rarely spoke of it. He merely kept it near him, as some men keep a saint's medal. Marco reached across the desk and lifted the watch as easily as if it had been his own. "A beautiful piece, fratello," he murmured, turning it in his fingers. "You know, every time I see it, I think of your father. He was the finest man I ever knew." Alessandro accepted the words with a nod. He was already looking back down at the papers. Marco held the watch a moment longer than was necessary, and then set it down. At that moment, out in the long corridor beyond the study, Elena passed by with an armful of fresh linens. She did not look in. She did not know she was being watched. Marco's gaze slid sideways after her. It lingered for only a breath, but in that breath something crossed his face that did not belong to a loyal brother, or to a man who called this house his home. It was gone before Alessandro looked up. By the time Alessandro raised his head, Marco was smiling at him again, warm as ever. Late that same afternoon, the light in the rose garden turned the color of steeped honey, and Mia remembered her doll. She had been playing near the small stone gardener's cottage that stood at the far end of the property, half hidden behind the tallest of the crimson roses. When Isabella had called her in for a cup of warm milk before supper, she had run back to the house so quickly that she had forgotten Rosa, her cloth doll with the yellow yarn hair, propped up against the cottage wall. Now, with the milk drunk and Isabella dozing in her armchair, Mia slipped out through the garden doors and set off along the gravel path alone. The garden was quieter at this hour. Bees had gone home. The gardeners had finished their rounds. The long shadows of the rose bushes reached across the grass like open fingers. Mia hummed to herself as she skipped between them, her small shoes crunching softly on the gravel, her mind already full of Rosa and the imaginary tea party they would have when she was safely tucked back into her little bed. She was halfway between the fountain and the cottage when she heard the voice. It was low. It was a woman's voice. It was coming from behind the thickest wall of red roses at the back of the garden. Mia stopped. She did not know why she stopped. Something in the tone did not belong to the garden. It was the same voice that had called Alessandro darling in the front hall, but softer now, and different, as though it were meant for other ears. Mia stepped off the gravel path and onto the grass so her shoes would make no sound. She crept forward until she could kneel behind a wide, thorned bush of deep crimson blossoms. Very slowly, she parted two of the leaves with her small fingers and peered through. Vivian was on the other side of the roses. Her back was pressed lightly against the old stone wall of the cottage. Her arms were around a man's neck. Mia could not see the man's face at first, only his dark hair and the sharp line of a shoulder in a well-cut jacket. Then he turned his head to speak, and Mia saw him clearly. It was Marco, Uncle Marco, the one who called Uncle Alessandro brother, the one whose smile everyone in the house believed, and Vivian was kissing him. Mia's small hand flew up to her own mouth by itself. Her heart began to knock so hard inside her chest that she was certain the roses would hear it. Just a little longer. Vivian was whispering against Marco's cheek. Her lips brushed his jaw as she spoke. After the wedding, everything becomes ours. All of it. We only have to wait, my love. We only have to wait. Marco murmured something back, low and pleased, and drew her closer. Mia did not understand what a wedding could give away. She did not understand what ours meant, or why grown-ups whispered when the sun was going down. But she understood, with the perfect clarity of a 5-year-old, one simple truth. The lady who was going to marry Uncle Alessandro should not be kissing another man in secret. Not ever. She let the leaves close again very carefully, so that not a single petal would tremble. Then she turned, and she ran. She ran across the grass in her small shoes, past the fountain, past the magnolia, up the gravel path, through the garden doors, along the long marble corridor, up the wide staircase. She did not stop until she stood, out of breath and wide-eyed, before a heavy dark door on the second floor, the door of Uncle Alessandro's study. Mia lifted her small hand to knock, and her small hand was shaking. The knock, when it finally came, was small enough that Alessandro almost did not hear it. He was bent over the desk, reading a report he had already read twice, and the sound was so soft that he might have taken it for the settling of the old house around him. It came a second time, still faint, still uncertain. "Come in," he said. The heavy door opened only wide enough to admit a small, dark head. Mia's face appeared at the level of the brass handle, her eyes very large in the golden lamplight of the study. Alessandro sat back in his chair, surprised. Children were not in the habit of climbing to the second floor to knock on his study door. In truth, no one in this house came into this room without being summoned. "Mia," he said, and his voice, without his intending it, softened into something almost gentle. "Come in, little one. Are you lost?" She shook her head. She stepped inside on quiet feet and let the door close behind her. She stopped a few paces from the desk, folded her small hands in front of her, and looked up at him. Her face was pale. Her cheeks had 2 bright spots of color that spoke of running. "What is it?" he asked. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, careful now, the way a grown man learns to be careful when he sees fear on a very small face. "Did something frighten you in the house? Tell me." Mia did not speak at once. She looked at the carpet. She looked at her own shoes. She looked at last, up into his eyes. "Uncle Alessandro," she said, in a voice no louder than a candle flame. Miss Vivian was kissing Uncle Marco. The silence that followed was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a room in which every clock, every fiber of wood, every breath of air seemed to stop at the same instant. Alessandro did not move. His hands, which had been resting lightly on the desk, did not move. His face did not change. Only the color, very slowly, drained from beneath his skin. There are truths that do not arrive at a man's door through months of patient investigation, or through the thick pages of a report prepared by careful men. There are truths that arrive instead through the smallest of witnesses, through eyes that do not yet understand what they have seen, through voices that have never learned to lie. Such truths cannot be argued with. They can only be received. For several long seconds, Alessandro did not trust himself to speak. When at last he did, his voice was steady, because he had spent his life training it to be steady when nothing else in him was. "Thank you, little one," he said quietly. "You did the right thing to come and tell me." Mia's lower lip trembled. He saw it, and something inside him tightened further. "Am I in trouble?" she whispered. "No," he said. "You are not in trouble. You will never be in trouble in this house for telling the truth. Do you understand?" She nodded. "But, Mia," he leaned forward a little, His voice was as gentle as he could make it, and beneath the gentleness lay a weight the child could not measure. "This is a secret between the two of us now. You must not tell your mother. You must not tell my mother. You must not tell anyone. Can you keep that secret for me?" She nodded again, more slowly. He rose and walked around the desk. He crouched down until his eyes were level with hers. He rested one large, careful hand for a moment on the top of her small, dark head. "Good girl," he said. He rang the bell on his desk and asked the maid who appeared to take Mia back to her mother. He did not touch the report on the desk. He did not touch the wine at his elbow. He watched the door close behind the little girl. He listened until the sound of her small footsteps had faded down the corridor. Then, and only then, did he sit back down. He remained very still, for what might have been minutes, and might have been an hour. His right hand rested on the surface of the desk, closed tightly around the silver pocket watch of his father. His knuckles had gone white around it. At last, without looking away from the door through which the child had vanished, he reached for his phone and dialed a single number. "Victor," he said softly, when the line opened. "Come to the study, come alone, and tell no one you were called." Victor arrived within 20 minutes. He wore the same plain dark coat he always wore, and he did not sit until Alessandro nodded toward the chair across the desk. The two men had known each other for many years. Victor did not need to be told that whatever he was about to hear had already changed the shape of the house around them. Alessandro spoke for a long time. Victor listened without interrupting, without writing, without lifting his eyes from a spot just below Alessandro's chin. When it was over, he asked only one question. "How far do you want me to go?" "As far as the truth goes," Alessandro said. "No further. Not yet." Victor rose, inclined his head, and walked out. From that night onward, a second life began to run beneath the surface of the Moretti estate, invisible to everyone who lived inside it. Victor's most trusted men were moved into positions that did not draw the eye. A driver was quietly replaced. A junior accountant was quietly added. Every phone that Marco Bellini used was quietly listened to. Every account into which his name had ever been signed was quietly opened. Above that second life, the first life of the house continued exactly as it had before. Alessandro sat across from Vivian at dinner and asked her about her afternoons. He touched her hand when she reached for his. He held the door for her when they walked into the sitting room. He allowed her to smooth the lapel of his jacket before she kissed his cheek goodnight. He met Marco Bellini for their weekly council in the study, poured him a glass from the crystal decanter with his own hand, and let the man clap his shoulder as he left. Every gesture cost Alessandro a small burning coal that he swallowed down and did not spit out. Only at night, long after Vivian's rooms had gone dark and the house had fallen into its deep marble silence, did he allow the coals to glow. He worked in the private library at the far end of the second floor. The door was heavy. The reports were spread across the long oak table. A single lamp burned above them, casting a low pool of yellow light that did not reach the corners of the room. One night, at almost 2 a.m, Elena passed through the corridor outside. She was carrying a small stack of freshly laundered towels to a linen cupboard that stood only a few doors down from the library. She did not expect anyone to be awake at that hour, but as she passed the library door, she saw that it stood ajar by no more than a hand's width, and from the crack a narrow band of yellow light fell across the marble floor. She glanced in without meaning to. She saw him. Alessandro was seated at the table with his sleeves rolled to his forearms, and his tie loosened at the throat. His hair had fallen forward over his brow. In one hand he held a page of typed lines. His other hand was pressed flat against the wood of the table, and the tension in his jaw was the tension of a man holding something very heavy in a very small place. Elena did not enter. She did not speak. She did not want him to know he had been seen. She continued along the corridor, put the towels away, and walked quietly down the back stairs to the kitchen. There she took the kettle she had already put on for herself, poured a cup of tea, added a slice of lemon and a spoon of honey, and carried it back up the way she had come. She pushed the library door open with her shoulder only enough to reach in. She set the small cup and saucer down on the corner of the table nearest the door. She did not look at his face. She did not say a word. Then she turned and left again. Alessandro looked up only after her footsteps had faded. The cup was still steaming. He watched the empty doorway for a long moment, and for the first time in many months something in this house felt, if only for the length of a breath, like a place a man could rest. Then his eyes returned to the page in his hand. And there, in the third paragraph, half hidden beneath a line of routine transfers, he found it, a wire, moved by Marco Bellini's hand, out of a hidden account, into a name that did not exist, and from there, across an ocean, into a country from which no one came back. 6 days later, Victor placed the finished file on Alessandro's desk and left the study without a word. Alessandro read the pages twice, the first time to know, the second time to be certain there was nothing his hope could still deny. The affair between Vivian and Marco Bellini had not begun a month ago, or 6 months ago. It had begun long before Alessandro had ever placed a ring on Vivian's finger. Their correspondence stretched back years, in the coded language of two people who had already learned to hide from a third. The plan was written between the lines of every message. Vivian would enter the family through the wedding. She would be given access to accounts, to safes, to signatures, to rooms that only a wife could enter. Once the doors were open, Marco would find his moment. It might have come during a business trip. It might have come during a hunt. It might have come in a dark car on a country road. Alessandro would have died in a way that looked, to the world, like an accident, and what remained of the Moretti name would have passed, quietly and legally, into the hands of a widow and her most loyal advisor. The file did not stop there. Attached to the back of the last page was a second document that Victor had gathered with a different kind of care. It was a list of testimonies from the staff of the house, signed, dated, sealed. A footman had heard Vivian call Isabella a burden, a peasant in silk, a woman who should have gone into a home years ago. A maid had watched Vivian dismiss Isabella's favorite tea, one Isabella had drunk every morning of her adult life, and replace it with something Vivian found more elegant. The kitchen staff had been given quiet instructions, more than once, to serve Isabella her meals alone in her sitting room when Alessandro was not at home, so that Vivian would not have to share her table with an old woman she found tiresome. There were small cruelties recorded in the file that Alessandro had never seen. There were larger cruelties recorded that he could not read without setting the paper down. His mother had said nothing to him, not one word. For months, he closed the file with the same steady hands that had opened it. He stood. He walked out of the study and along the long marble corridor and up the second flight of stairs to his mother's private wing. It was late. The house was asleep. A single lamp burned inside Isabella's sitting room when he pushed the door open. She was seated by the window in her nightdress and a shawl. On her lap lay the worn purse she had carried on the day of the sidewalk. Between her fingers she held a small square of paper that had faded to soft browns and pale yellows. The photograph. Alessandro crossed the room without a sound and knelt on the carpet beside her chair. Only when he was close enough to see the picture did he understand what she was holding. A tall man in a dark coat, his hand on the shoulder of a small boy. The boy was looking up at the man with a wide, uncomplicated smile. The boy was himself, at 5. He had not seen the photograph in more than 20 years. "Mama," he said. His voice came out lower and rougher than he had expected. "Why did you never tell me?" Isabella did not startle. She did not look at him with surprise. She had known, perhaps for a long time, that this moment would come, and she had prepared for it in the way old women prepare for weather. She turned the photograph slowly in her fingers. She looked at the boy. She looked at her son. Her eyes were very calm. "Tell you what, my love?" she said softly. "About her," he answered. "About all of it. About what she has been doing to you in this house." Isabella's mouth opened a little. Then it closed. Then she smiled, and the smile was the saddest thing he had ever seen. "Because," she said, "I thought that you loved her." 2 tears slid down her cheeks without her seeming to notice them. Her hand, thin and light as a bird, reached out and rested on the top of his bowed head, exactly as his father's hand had rested on the boy's shoulder in the photograph. Alessandro could not answer. He stayed there for a long time with his forehead against her knee. When he rose at last and left her room, his eyes were red-rimmed and dry, and his right hand at his side was clenched so tightly that the knuckles had gone the color of bone. Marco Bellini had survived many years at the second chair by the simple habit of noticing what other men did not bother to notice. He noticed, over the following days, that Alessandro had grown too polite. Alessandro had always been a courteous man in his own house, but this new courtesy was different. It was too even. It never slipped. It never warmed. He poured Marco's brandy with the same steady hand as ever, but the hand did not linger at his shoulder the way it once had. He listened to Marco's opinions on the week's business with careful attention, but he no longer interrupted with the small brotherly jokes of 20 years. His eyes, when they rested on Marco, rested a fraction of a second too long. A man who has spent his life planning a betrayal learns, sooner or later, the exact temperature at which his own skin begins to burn. Marco did not wait for the burn. That night he did not sleep. He made 3 telephone calls from a phone that had never been listed under his name. Before dawn, the plan he had kept in reserve for years. The one meant for a moment such as this, moved into motion. The house was still deep in its marble silence when it happened. No servant heard, no dog on the grounds barked. The tall iron gates did not open. Only a small side door near the garden clicked, softly closed at 3:15 in the morning, and the darkness of the property swallowed the men who had walked back through it. Elena was the one who found the room. She rose at her usual hour, dressed in the pale gray of early morning, and prepared Isabella's breakfast tray with the same care she brought to it every day. Warm bread, a small pot of the tea Isabella had drunk since she was a young woman, a single rose from the garden, still wet with dew, laid across the corner of the tray. She carried it up the wide staircase and along the second-floor corridor. She stopped outside Isabella's door. It stood ajar, only by a hand's width. But Isabella never slept with her door open. Elena knocked softly. There was no answer. She pushed the door with the edge of the tray. It swung inward on quiet hinges. The lamp beside the bed was still on. The bed itself was empty. The coverlet had been thrown halfway to the floor, as though something had been pulled from beneath it in a hurry. On the carpet at the foot of the bed, one small slipper lay on its side, the other nowhere in sight. And there, half hidden between the corner of the rug and the leg of the nightstand, lay a scatter of dark round beads, broken pearls. Isabella's rosary of black pearls, the one she had worn at her throat every day since she was a young bride, had been torn apart at the clasp. The beads had rolled across the floor in a small, scattered constellation of struggle. The tray in Elena's hands began to shake. The rose slid off the edge and fell soundlessly onto the carpet. She screamed. The house woke in a way it had never woken before. Doors flew open. Footsteps ran on marble. Someone was shouting. Someone was calling for Alessandro. Someone was calling for Victor. Elena stood in the doorway of the empty bedroom with the tray still in her hands and could not move. Alessandro reached the room in less than a minute. He did not stop at the doorway. He crossed to the scattered beads, knelt, and picked one up between his thumb and forefinger. He rose slowly with the small, dark pearl closed inside his fist. From somewhere in the study below, his private phone began to ring. He walked down the corridor without hurrying, because a man in that much pain cannot afford to hurry. He entered his study. He picked up the phone. "Fratello," said a voice he had known for 30 years. "I understand you have a full file on me now. That was clever of you, but I have something you value more than files." There was a pause. Then, quieter, almost gentle. "Bring me every page, every recording, every witness. Deliver them to me by nightfall and let me leave the country in peace. Do this, and your mother comes home. Refuse me, and she does not." Alessandro did not speak. He did not curse. He did not argue. He set the phone down on its cradle without saying a single word. At that same moment, 2 floors above, Victor pushed open the door of Vivian's bedroom with 2 of his men behind him. Vivian was already half-dressed, a small suitcase open on the bed, a passport in her hand. She had time only to lift her face. She did not have time to run. Alessandro walked back up the stairs alone. In the corridor outside Isabella's empty room, Elena still stood where she had frozen, the tray finally set down on a side table, her hands pressed together in front of her mouth. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her for one long moment. Then, slowly, he lifted his hand and rested it on her shoulder. It was the first time they had ever touched. "Thank you," he said, very softly. "Thank you for finding her first." The rest of that day passed the way a nightmare passes when it will not end. Victor's men fanned out across the city and beyond it. The addresses Marco Bellini had ever been associated with were checked one by one. A warehouse near the docks, a shuttered restaurant in the outer boroughs, a hunting lodge upstate that had once belonged to his uncle, a quiet apartment in a building whose doorman had been paid too well to remember any faces. Each address, when they reached it, was empty. Each empty room felt like another door slammed in Alessandro's face. By early afternoon, Alessandro understood what was happening. Marco had laid these places down like stones for the search to trip over. Each false trail was designed to eat an hour. Every hour that was eaten was another hour of an old woman's failing strength in a place none of them could find. Alessandro stood in the study with his hands flat on the desk. The reports of failed searches spread before him, and did not speak. Victor stood by the door in complete silence. There was nothing yet to say. In the kitchen at the far end of the house, Elena sat on a low wooden stool with Mia curled tight against her chest. The little girl had not cried aloud, but she was trembling in small, quiet waves, as though something inside her understood more than her age should allow. Elena stroked her daughter's hair and stared at the far wall, and did not see it. She was trying, with everything she had, to remember. She had lived in this house for months now. She had passed Marco Bellini in these corridors more times than she could count. She had served him wine. She had cleared his plates. She had listened, without listening, to the way he spoke about himself at his ease. Somewhere in all those small overheard sentences, there had to be something. There had to be one loose thread he had let fall without noticing. She closed her eyes. Wine glasses. A polished laugh from Vivian across the table. Marco leaning back in his chair. A fork loose in his hand, telling a story about being a boy. A summer. A dog. A road. A house. Elena's eyes opened. An old house, she whispered aloud. Mia lifted her head, confused. Elena was already setting her down, standing up, wiping her hands on her apron. She half ran through the corridors and up the stairs. She did not stop at the study door. She pushed it open. Signor Alessandro. Both men turned. A few weeks ago, Elena said, her voice not quite steady. At dinner, Signor Bellini told a story. He was in a good mood. He had drunk 2 glasses of wine. He spoke about a house his family owned when he was a boy, out in the countryside, past the last of the lights of the city. He said she pressed her fingers to her temple, forcing the exact phrase back into place. He said it was the kind of place no one remembers anymore, that it had been closed up for years, that there were still trees around it that his grandfather had planted. Alessandro was already looking at Victor. Victor left the room without a word. The sound of his footsteps down the corridor was the fastest thing Elena had ever heard in that house. He returned within the quarter hour with a single folded page in his hand. He laid it on the desk. Alessandro read it. He looked up at Elena. It exists, he said quietly. It is real. The land is held under the name of a company that owns nothing else. The house itself has been abandoned for almost 20 years. It is exactly where he said it was. Alessandro folded the page and slid it into the inside pocket of his coat. He was already moving toward the door when Elena's voice stopped him. I am coming with you. He turned. He looked at her as though he had not quite heard her. This is not a place for you, he said. His voice was gentler than the words. Elena, you do not understand what may be inside that house. I understand your mother, she answered. I understand what she looks like when she is frightened, and when she is cold, and when she has not eaten. I understand what it will do to her, in that first moment, to see a face she has learned to trust. I am coming. Alessandro did not answer at once. He looked at her for a long moment across the study. Then he inclined his head. Once. Stay close to me, he said. Do not leave my side. The convoy left the estate a little after nightfall. 3 dark cars, headlights low, moved in silence through the iron gates and out onto the road that would carry them past the last street lamps of the city. On the 2nd floor of the house, in the window of the room she shared with her mother, Mia stood on tiptoe with both small palms pressed flat against the cold glass, watching the red taillights until they disappeared into the dark. The convoy left the last of the city lights behind and drove for almost an hour along a road that grew narrower with every mile. The trees on either side leaned closer. The pavement gave way at last to a long, unpaved lane that climbed a slow rise and disappeared into thin woods. Alessandro raised his hand, and the 3 cars killed their headlights together, coasting the final stretch on nothing but the pale silver of a low moon. They stopped at the edge of the tree line. The old Bellini house stood at the far end of a clearing that the forest had been slowly taking back for 20 years. It was 2 stories of pale stone gone gray with damp, its shutters closed, its chimney silent. A single faint light burned somewhere on the ground floor. Nothing else in the whole clearing moved. Alessandro divided his men with 2 silent gestures. Victor took a small group around to the rear of the house, sliding among the trees like water. Alessandro himself, with Elena kept firmly at his back, moved toward the front along the softest of the fallen leaves. There was no need for orders. The sounds that followed did not belong to the ordinary night. The soft crunch of careful footsteps on dry leaves, the metallic click of something being readied without ever being fired, a door somewhere at the back of the house giving way with the muffled crack of old wood. A second door, closer, breaking under the shoulder of a man in a dark coat. A short, sharp intake of breath, the heavy fall of a body settling too quickly onto a floor. And then, echoing along a hallway that had not held a voice in 20 years, the ragged breathing of men who had been surprised in the middle of a plan they had believed no one would find. Alessandro moved through the front hall with his flashlight held low. The narrow white beam slid across walls furred with mildew, across a staircase whose banister had rotted through, across a mirror so cracked it returned his face to him in 3 separate pieces. He did not look at himself. They found her in the cellar. Elena descended the stone steps first, because Alessandro allowed her to. The flashlight in her hand shook. At the foot of the steps, the beam swept across a bare earth floor, across a broken chair, and stopped in the far corner, where a small figure sat huddled against the damp wall. Isabella. Her silver hair had come loose about her shoulders. Her nightdress was smudged with dust. Her feet, bare where the slippers had been left behind, were blue with cold. Her eyes were half closed. Her lips moved without sound, and in one thin, trembling hand, closed against her chest as tightly as a child's fist around a candy, she still gripped a single unbroken length of her torn rosary, 3 dark pearls, on a scrap of black thread. Elena did not shout. She did not gasp. She crossed the earthen floor in 3 steps, dropped to her knees, and gathered the old woman into her arms. "Isabella," she whispered, exactly the way she whispered her daughter's name in the night when Mia had a fever. "Isabella, Cara, it is Elena. I am here. Look at me. You are safe now. You are safe." Isabella's eyes opened a little more. They found Elena's face. A small sound came out of her, half a word, half a breath. At that same moment, at the back of the house, a shadow moved. Alessandro turned toward it, through a doorway at the end of the ground floor hall, past a broken screen and out onto a small stone porch. He saw a man he had known since boyhood step into the moonlight of the clearing. Marco Bellini carried a leather bag in one hand. His coat was already buttoned. His face, when he glanced back once at the house, held no shame. It held only the calm of a man who had decided a long time ago that when the ground gave way beneath him, he would run. He began to run. Every muscle in Alessandro's body rose at once and screamed for him to follow. 30 years of brotherhood turned to a single line of white fire that ran from his chest to his fists. His feet were already moving. 3 long strides carried him out of the front hall and into the corridor that led toward the back of the house. Behind him, from the cellar steps, Elena's voice tore up through the silence of the old house. "Signor Alessandro, come, please. She is fading. Her breath is going short. Please." Alessandro stopped in the middle of the corridor. There are moments in a man's life when he is asked to choose between 2 of the things he loves most in the world, and neither choice will give him back the one he does not take. Such moments do not test what he can do. They test who he is. Every year of a man's living passes through the eye of a single second, and what emerges on the other side is the shape of his soul. The flashlight in his hand fell against his thigh. The beam of moonlight coming through a shattered window ahead of him cut across his face at an angle, dividing it precisely between light and darkness, one half silvered like his mother's hair, the other half lost in the black hallway behind him. He stood, unmoving, at the exact center of that line. Alessandro turned. He turned so completely that his shoulder brushed the peeling wallpaper of the corridor. His footsteps in the empty hallway did not hurry now. They fell heavy and certain, one after the other, back the way he had come. The stone stairs to the cellar sank beneath his weight without a sound of protest. He crossed the earthen floor and knelt beside his mother. Elena had already loosened the collar of the nightdress and was chafing warmth back into Isabella's cold hands. She looked up as he arrived and moved aside just enough to make room for him without letting go of the old woman. "Mama," Alessandro said. His voice was low and gentle in a way that his own men would not have recognized. "Mama, it is your son. I am here." Isabella's eyes had begun to close again. At the sound of his voice they opened. Something in them steadied. Her thin fingers, still curled around the 3 surviving pearls, uncurled slowly and reached for his. He caught her hand and folded it inside his own. Behind him, on the stone steps, Victor had appeared. He stood without speaking. His face was carefully empty. His right hand rested at his side, close to his coat. Alessandro did not turn his head. He only lifted his eyes. The look that passed between the 2 men was not a sentence. It was not even a word. It was a small, precise instruction, refined by 20 years of standing in the same rooms and reading the same silences. Victor did not need to be told twice. He inclined his head no more than a breath, and was already moving up the steps and out into the clearing before Alessandro's gaze returned to his mother's face. In the inside pocket of Alessandro's coat, resting against his ribs, was a small hard shape that his heart, without his knowing it, beat against. His father's silver pocket watch. It ticked faintly in the dark against his chest, patient as the tide. "The blood you carry, my son," his father had told him once, on a summer evening long ago in this same country, "is not made only of what you take from those who wrong you. It is made also of what you protect from harm. The first can be given to any man. The second is the harder thing. The second is what keeps a house standing." Alessandro had not thought of those words in many years. He thought of them now. He slid one arm beneath his mother's shoulders and the other beneath her knees. He lifted her as easily as if she were the child in the photograph, and he, the tall man beside her. Elena rose with them, one hand pressed to the small of Isabella's back, one hand still holding the old woman's cold fingers. They carried her up the stone steps together, out of the cellar and along the corridor, and through the front hall of the abandoned house. Once, as they turned to fit through the narrow doorway, Alessandro's eyes met Elena's over the silver of his mother's hair. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them promised anything, but something passed between them in that half-second that had not been there before. It was not a beginning. It was too quiet for a beginning. It was only the small, unspoken recognition of two people who had, at the same moment, in the same house, chosen the same person to save. Outside, the clearing lay silver under the low moon. The dark cars waited at the tree line. Alessandro laid his mother across the back seat of the middle car with the care he might have used for something made of thin glass. Elena climbed in beside her and drew the old woman gently against her shoulder. Alessandro closed the door. Somewhere far off in the trees, deep in the black shape of the forest, a single short sound rose and fell and was gone. It was over almost before the ear was certain it had been there at all. To an outsider, it might have been a branch cracking under the weight of an animal. To the men who had grown up in this life, it was something else. It was the sound of a debt being closed in the way this family had always closed debts. Alessandro did not turn his head toward it. He walked around the car in silence, opened the driver's door of the lead vehicle, and swung himself into the front seat beside his driver. The engines turned. The three dark cars rolled slowly back down the unpaved lane, then out onto the road, then toward the distant glow of the city on the horizon. In the back seat of the middle car, Isabella let her silver head come to rest against Elena's shoulder. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes closed at last in something that was no longer fear. Cradled in her open palm, the three unbroken pearls of her rosary lay warm against her skin, held safe by fingers that had refused, all night long, to let them go. The tall iron gates opened for them just before dawn. The three dark cars slipped through in silence and rolled up the curved drive to the front steps, where every window of the great house burned yellow, waiting. Isabella was carried inside in Alessandro's own arms. The family physician, an older man who had been on the estate since before Alessandro was born, was already waiting at the top of the stairs with his black bag. Elena climbed the steps beside them and did not let go of the old woman's hand until the bedroom door closed behind the doctor. Alessandro did not enter the room. He stood in the corridor outside, one shoulder pressed lightly against the wall, and he waited. He did not sit. He did not accept the coat someone tried to take from him. He watched the closed door and did not move for almost an hour. When at last the door opened, the physician stepped out, closing it softly behind him. He was a man not given to comforting phrases. "She is exhausted," he said quietly. "She is dehydrated. She is bruised only where she was gripped. Her heart is tired, but it is strong. She needs warmth. She needs food. She needs quiet. Give her these, and she will be herself again in a few days." Alessandro closed his eyes for one long breath. "Thank you," he said. Then he turned and walked back down the long marble corridor toward the stairs. In the great drawing room on the ground floor, 3 lamps had been lit, and every servant had been sent away. Victor stood by the tall window with his hands folded in front of him. In the center of the room, on the pale carpet, Vivian sat very straight in a high-backed chair. Her hair was still pinned. Her dress was still perfect. Only her eyes had changed. They were the eyes of a woman who had understood, at last, exactly where she was. Alessandro crossed the room and stopped in front of her. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his hand. He simply looked at her for a long moment, as one might look at a room whose door one is about to close forever. "You have lost something tonight that is far greater than any fortune you thought you were about to marry," he said quietly. "You have lost the one man who could have loved you honestly. That is the only true wealth a person is ever given, and you sold it before you ever held it in your hands." Vivian's lips parted. They trembled. No sound came out. She closed them again. Alessandro turned to Victor. "Take her out of this house. Tonight." Victor inclined his head. He stepped forward, lifted Vivian gently but without ceremony from the chair, and led her out through the front hall. She did not resist. She did not look back. The copies of the file that Victor had prepared over the course of that long dark week were already, by that hour, in the hands of the people to whom they most needed to be shown, within the walls of the family itself. In the private council that met at the estate 2 nights later, every cousin, every lieutenant, every silent partner learned the full shape of what had almost been done. Names were spoken and names were unspoken. Positions were emptied. Positions were filled. Alessandro rebuilt the inner circle of the Moretti house from the wood upward, and when he was finished, every man who stood closest to him had earned that place twice over. That same night, after the last car had rolled back through the iron gates, and the estate had returned to its own silence, Alessandro walked down the back stairs alone. He found Elena in the kitchen. She was standing at the deep porcelain sink with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, rinsing a small stack of cups that no one had ordered her to wash. The lamp above her cast a low, warm light across the counter and turned the water on her forearms to gold. She had not heard him come in. Her hands were still wet when she reached for a cloth. She did not know it yet, but she was about to be spoken to in a way no one had ever spoken to her before. Morning came into Isabella's bedroom on quiet feet. The heavy curtains had been drawn back only a hand's width, and a slow, pale bar of light lay across the foot of the bed. The old woman opened her eyes to the sound of birds in the magnolia outside her window, and for a long moment she did not remember where she was, or that she was safe, or that she was warm. Then she saw the crayon drawing on the wall beside her bed. 4 figures, a tall man, a silver-haired woman, a young woman in an apron, a small child in the middle, arms stretched wide, one hand joined to each of the grown-ups on either side. She closed her eyes again. She let a breath out that she had been holding, without knowing she was holding it, for a very long time. The physician came, checked her pulse, listened to her chest, nodded once with satisfaction, and left. A maid brought warm broth on a tray and set it beside her, then withdrew. Somewhere below in the house, Isabella could hear the ordinary morning noises of a place that had chosen, overnight, to become a home again. There was a small, careful knock at the door. "Come in, my darling," Isabella said. Her voice was thinner than usual, but it was hers. The door pushed open by only a hand's width. A small, dark head appeared at the level of the brass handle. "Grandmother," Mia whispered. The word had not been arranged between them. It had simply, that morning, found its way onto the little girl's tongue. Isabella opened her arms without a word. Mia crossed the room in 6 flying steps and climbed onto the high bed and burrowed straight into the old woman's embrace. Dark curls against silver hair, small warm cheek against a paper-thin one. She held on with all the strength her 5-year-old arms could gather. She did not cry. She did not speak for a long time. When at last she pulled back only enough to look up into Isabella's face, she asked only one thing. "You will not have to be sad anymore, will you?" Isabella looked down at the child in her arms. She looked at the little face that had knelt beside her on a crowded sidewalk without knowing her name. She looked at the small hand that had gathered her scattered life back into her purse and pressed a bottle of water into her trembling fingers. She looked at the same hand, only weeks later, that had drawn her back into a family she had believed she had already outlived. Something inside her that had been shut for many years opened. Isabella began to cry, not the silent tears she had allowed herself before, not the quiet slipping of water down a lined cheek. These were the tears of a woman weeping out loud, at last, with her whole chest, into the hair of a 5-year-old child who held her tighter with every sob. Mia let her cry for as long as she needed to. Then, when the shaking eased, the little girl sat back on her heels and slid the pink backpack off her shoulders. She unzipped it with both small hands, exactly the way she had unzipped it once on a red-lit sidewalk in the middle of Manhattan, and drew out a small bottle of water. She uncapped it. She held it up. "Mama says you should drink slowly," she said seriously. Isabella took the bottle in her thin, trembling fingers. She lifted it to her lips. She drank in small, careful sips, exactly as she had been told, and did not take her eyes from the child's face for a single second. In the doorway, Alessandro stood without moving. He had come up the corridor without a sound. He had meant to knock. Instead, he had stopped at the sight of the 2 of them, the old woman and the small child, and had not been able to lift his hand. His eyes moved from his mother's wet face to the crayon drawing on the wall. Beneath each of the 4 figures now, in a fresh line of careful pencil, someone had written a name. Alessandro, Isabella, Elena, Mia. A great house is built out of many things. It is built out of power, and out of money, and out of the loyalty of those who stand beside its master through many long years. These things are necessary, and these things are true. And yet, when the storm at last comes for the roof of such a house, it is very rarely any of these things that keeps it standing. Sometimes what saves an entire bloodline, in the end, is not the strength of any of its men, but a single, small hand that was never taught to step past another person's pain. Alessandro drew a slow breath. He stepped into the room. He crossed to the bed and lowered himself into the chair beside his mother. He took her free hand into his own and held it. Isabella squeezed his fingers with a strength that surprised him. Behind him, Elena had entered without a sound and stopped a pace inside the door, her hands folded in front of her apron, not certain if she had the right to come any closer. Alessandro did not turn his head to look for her. He did not need to. He simply extended his other hand, palm open, out into the space beside his chair. He said nothing. Elena stood still for one small heartbeat. Then she stepped forward. She lifted her hand. She placed it into his. Many months later, the light in Manhattan fell across the same avenue, in the same slow copper streaks, as though the city itself had chosen to remember. The tall buildings glowed. The cars crawled home with their headlights already on. The crowds flowed along the sidewalks as they always had, some hurrying, some talking, most of them looking only at the small screens in their hands. 4 people walked together against that ordinary tide. Mia went first, a little taller than she had been on the evening this story began, a little steadier on her small shoes, a little more careful with the pink backpack that still rode on her shoulders. Beside her, one hand resting lightly on the child's, walked Isabella. Her silver hair was pinned as always. A new rosary of black pearls rested at her throat. Her eyes, once so tired, caught the last of the sun with a clear and quiet brightness. They stopped in the middle of the block, at a place that had no marker for anyone else in the whole city. A small square of ordinary pavement in front of an ordinary shop window. The place where, a season ago, an old woman had swayed and fallen and been carried gently to a stone bench by a mother and a child who did not know her name. Mia turned to face Isabella. She slid the pink backpack off her shoulders. She unzipped it with both small hands. She drew out a small bottle of water. She uncapped it. She held it up. Isabella took it into her thin, steady fingers. She lifted it slowly to her lips. She drank in careful sips, exactly as she had been taught by a child who had, in turn, been taught by her mother. When she lowered the bottle, she smiled at Mia with the kind of smile that does not belong to anyone else on any other street. A few paces behind them, Elena and Alessandro walked slowly. Her hand was in his. He did not hold it tightly. He did not need to. There were no great promises between them, no long speeches, no rings yet exchanged in front of witnesses. There was only this, a hand in a hand, a walk along a sidewalk at sunset, a quiet that had chosen to stay. They stopped a small distance from the child and the old woman, and simply watched.